228 years. If nothing were to change, it would take 228 years for the typical African American household to equal the wealth of the typical white American household today. This is what we refer to as the racial wealth gap. But in fact, it's actually a bit of a misnomer to refer to it as a gap, because since the 1980s, the gap has expanded and accelerated, so much so that we're really facing a chasm. And this is not a challenge that is posed against just African Americans and other minority groups. This is a challenge for all of us. It is predicted that in the next few decades, America will actually become a majority minority country, with most Americans being on the other side of the racial wealth chasm. So we know that the median wealth for a white American household is $142,000. It drops to $14,000 for the median wealth for a Latino and non-white Hispanic household. And then it drops even further down to $11,000 for the typical African American household. However, when we begin to talk about the racial wealth chasm nationally, it becomes a very overwhelming question. And so we're going to bring it back home a little bit, make it more personal, and talk a bit about my hometown of Baltimore. So Baltimore is a place with unbridled promise, but also several challenges, one of which is structural racism, mass incarceration, and post-industrialization. 63% of Baltimore is African American, and since 1969, between 1969 and 2009, there have been over 95,000 jobs that have been lost in the city. Now, most of those jobs were quality-paying jobs that allowed individuals to support their families, and most of those jobs are now gone. This is a story that's very familiar in places like Indianapolis, Baltimore, Cleveland, and places across the country. 23% of Baltimoreans live below the poverty line. However, when you break it down between the races, it actually boils down to over 24% of African Americans in Baltimore live below the poverty line, compared to only 8% of white Baltimoreans. Additionally, 61% of Baltimoreans live in low-income households. And again, this is not just a story of Baltimore, this is a story of many communities across the country. We spend over $289 million a year incarcerating Baltimoreans in the state of Maryland. And this is really close to home. We have 19,000 African American males between the ages of 25 and 54 that are prematurely away from daily civic life in Baltimore City. I turned 33 this summer. And this absence in daily life is typically caused by a number of factors, but specifically incarceration and premature death caused by homicide, but also through health issues. Now, this represents 45% of African American men between the ages of 25 and 54 in Baltimore City. Now let's get down to some of the economic disparities. White households in Baltimore have 2 times the income of an African American household. 33%, a third of African American households have negative net worth, compared to only 15% of white households. Now, one of the other challenges is that there are opportunities, there are jobs in places like Baltimore City or in the surrounding counties. However, it takes most individuals over 90 minutes on public transit to get to quality paying jobs. However, working age Baltimoreans, only 30% have regular access to vehicles. So that means they're taking public transit, and it makes it really difficult to get to quality jobs when it takes over 90 minutes to get to them. Now here's the kicker. Only 3% of Black-owned businesses in Baltimore have employees. Most are sole proprietors. And this is a problem across the country. However, 26% of white-owned businesses have jobs. And this is really where there's an opportunity for attacking the issue of the racial wealth chasm. There's actually mounting evidence that business ownership is the best remedy for the racial wealth chasm. In fact, more so than home ownership. And this is where we have tremendous opportunity to invest in business ownership and entrepreneurship in ways that will advance across all racial classes, but in particular for African Americans and Latinos. Just as an example, while only 3% of Black-owned businesses across the country have employees, if we were to add 1 employee to 15% of those employee-less businesses, and then were to add 2 employees to the African American owned businesses that do have employees, we'd have an additional 600,000 jobs in this country. The Center for Global Policy Studies actually estimates that if we were to eliminate racial bias in entrepreneurship and small business ownership in this country, we would add over $300 million, actually $300 billion with the B, dollars to our economy. So again, this is not a challenge just for minority groups in this country. Those will be jobs for all Americans. However, one of the biggest challenges is that, particularly for African American and Latinos, having access to capital to begin businesses is a huge challenge, to begin them and then also grow them. The Kauffman Foundation, which is a foundation dedicated to entrepreneurship, estimates that it takes at least $30,000 to begin a business. But you saw the stats earlier. How do you start a business that will cost you $30,000 if your household wealth is only 14 or 11? The Small Business Administration, which is really tasked with making sure that we have access to capital for all entrepreneurs, and in particular, those that are marginalized, in 2015, only 2% of their loans went to African Americans, compared to 70% for white Americans. If you're familiar with the tech startup space, if you're someone that's looking for venture capital, less than 1% of venture capital goes into the hands of an African American startup founder. They don't even know, because it's such a small data point, how many Latino and Hispanic founders are receiving venture capital, but we do know that it's less than 1%. In Baltimore, 85% of individuals that are incarcerated are African American. But as I mentioned before, Baltimore is represented 63% African American. So imagine if, instead of representing 85% of the prison rate, the incarceration rate, in a place like Baltimore, African Americans represented 85% of small business ownership, represented 85% of entrepreneurs, how the economy will look differently. Consider that in the state of Maryland, it costs nearly $40,000 a year to incarcerate an individual. And as I said earlier, it costs $30,000 to start a new business. Imagine that instead of incarcerating individuals for $40,000 a year, we actually began to give and invested in individuals to the tune of $30,000 to start new businesses. The question before all of us is, do we want to be a country in which we incarcerate and put people in jail? Or do we want to be a country in which we invest in small businesses, entrepreneurship, and job creation? Thank you.